I never expected that a catastrophic plumbing failure would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. Before the flood, my life was a series of carefully curated routines, a quiet rhythm of existence I had designed for maximum efficiency and minimum emotional turbulence. But a torrent of water from the apartment upstairs washed it all away, and in the wreckage, I found something I hadn't even realized I was missing. My name is Lucas. At the time, I was 28, a freelance illustrator living and working in a converted brick warehouse that had more character than it had modern amenities. My apartment was my sanctuary and my office, a single, large room with high ceilings, exposed ductwork, and a massive arched window that looked out over the quieter side of the city. I lived by the steady beat of deadlines and the quiet hum of my drawing tablet. It was a solitary life, but not necessarily a lonely one. Or so I told myself. The man upstairs was Julian. He was a ghost I knew primarily through sound. The rhythmic scrape of a hand playing across wood in the late afternoon. The low thud of a heavy plank being set down. The faint, bass-heavy rumble of his taste in classic rock that would sometimes vibrate through my floorboards on a Saturday night. He was a custom furniture maker, a fact I'd learned from our building manager, Mr. Henderson. In person, Julian was even more potent. We'd cross paths in the hallway or by the mailboxes, and he'd always offer a slight, reserved nod and a quiet, "Hey." He was tall, with broad shoulders that his simple t-shirts seemed to fight a losing battle with. His forearms were a roadmap of faint scars and sawdust, and his dark hair was always in a state of controlled disarray. He had this focused intensity about him, a seriousness in the set of his jaw that would only soften when he offered that brief, polite greeting. To me, he was a work of art from a gallery I could never afford to enter. He moved with a self-assured confidence that felt galaxies away from my own quiet, observational existence. I'd see him hauling lumber from his truck, the muscles in his back and arms straining, and my stomach would perform a sad little gymnastics routine. He was, in my mind, the very definition of a man who had his life figured out, a man who probably had a beautiful, willowy girlfriend who loved the smell of sawdust. He was completely, utterly, and safely unattainable. And so, he became the subject of my daydreams, a harmless crush I could file away under, never going to happen. My days followed a predictable pattern. I'd wake up with the morning light, make coffee, and sit at my drafting table, which I had positioned perfectly under that big window. I'd work for hours, losing myself in the worlds I was paid to create for children's books and graphic novels. My interactions were mostly digital, emails from clients, video calls with art directors. The most consistent physical presence in my life was the food delivery guy. That was the extent of my world. Safe, controlled, and meticulously ordered. Julian, on the other hand, was a creature of tangible things. He built solid objects, things you could touch and use and pass down through generations. I created fleeting images on a screen. The contrast felt profound. Sometimes, when I heard him working above me, a steady, patient sound of creation, I'd stop drawing and just listen. It was a comforting noise, a reminder that there was another person nearby, living a life that was both parallel and perpendicular to my own. I constructed a whole personality for him based on those sounds. Dependable, strong, meticulous. I was an architect of a fantasy, and from my safe distance, it was a beautiful design. That's how life works sometimes, isn't it? You build these neat little boxes for everyone, for yourself, and you live within those confines because it's easier than dealing with the messy, unpredictable reality. My reality was pixels and deadlines. His was wood grain and varnish. And never the twain shall meet. Until, of course, they did. In the most chaotic and damp way imaginable. The inciting incident, the catalyst for it all, began on a Tuesday. It started not with a bang, but with a drip. A single, annoying drop of water that landed squarely on my forehead as I was sketching. I looked up at my ceiling and saw a small, discolored patch on the old plaster, a dark bloom that hadn't been there an hour before. Then another drip hit my tablet. I sighed, grabbed a bucket from under the sink, and placed it on the floor, figuring it was just one of the quirks of living in an old building. But the drip became a trickle. The trickle became a steady stream. Within 20 minutes, the small dark patch had grown into a weeping wound in my ceiling, and the sound was no longer a gentle plink but a steady, alarming pour. Panic began to set in. I frantically started moving my electronics, my books, my artwork, piling everything onto my bed on the far side of the room. The water was starting to pool on my hardwood floors, and I was using every towel I owned to build a pathetic, failing dam. That's when I heard the frantic pounding on my door. I sloshed my way over and threw it open to find Julian standing there, looking utterly wrecked. His hair was wet and plastered to his forehead, his shirt was soaked through, and his face was pale with horror. "Oh God," he said, his voice strained. He wasn't looking at me, but past me, at the waterfall currently descending into my living space. "I am so sorry. A main water line in my wall just let go. I shut it off, but..." His voice trailed off as a large piece of plaster from my ceiling gave way and crashed into the bucket, sending a spray of gray, gritty water across the room. We both just stood there for a second, watching the destruction. There was nothing to say. Mr. Henderson was called, emergency plumbers were summoned, and the verdict was delivered with a grim finality. Julian's apartment had suffered significant water damage, but mine, being directly below the burst pipe, was a disaster zone. The ceiling was compromised, the floor was soaked, and the electricity had to be shut off in my unit as a precaution. "It'll be at least a week, maybe more," Mr. Henderson said, shaking his head. "We have to dry everything out, check the wiring, replace the ceiling and a section of the floor. You can't stay here, Lucas." My heart sank. A hotel? A friend's couch? My perfectly ordered life had just been liquefied and poured down the drain. I must have looked as lost as I felt, because Julian, who had been standing silently by, stepped forward. His face was a mask of guilt. "No," he said, his voice firm. "No, this is my fault. You're not going to a hotel." He finally looked directly at me, his brown eyes filled with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I have a guest room. It's small, and it's on the other side of my place, completely dry. Please, stay with me. It's the least I can do." I opened my mouth to protest, to say it was too much of an imposition, that I'd be fine. But the words wouldn't come out. The idea of being in his space, of spending a week in close proximity to this man I'd only admired from a distance, was both terrifying and undeniably thrilling. It was an insane proposition. He was a practical stranger. But looking at the genuine remorse in his eyes, and then back at the dripping cavern that used to be my home, I found myself nodding. "Okay," I heard myself say, the word feeling foreign in my own mouth. "Okay, thank you." And just like that, the walls I had so carefully maintained, both literal and metaphorical, came crashing down. I was about to step into Julian's world, and I had no idea if I would come out the other side unscathed. The quiet rhythm of my life had just been replaced by the roaring, unpredictable sound of a flood. Moving my essential belongings upstairs felt surreal. Julian insisted on carrying everything, his easy strength making my computer and box of clothes look like children's toys. His apartment was a reflection of him in a way I hadn't anticipated. It smelled incredible, a warm, clean mix of sawdust, lemon oil, and something else I couldn't place, maybe brewing coffee. The layout was similar to mine, one large open space, but where my apartment was filled with soft textiles and digital tools, his was a testament to the analog world. The furniture, of course, was stunning. A massive dining table made from a single slab of walnut, a sleek, minimalist coffee table, and bookshelves that fit so perfectly into an alcove they seemed to have grown there. Everything was his own work, I realized. It was beautiful, functional, and imbued with a sense of permanence. But it wasn't what surprised me. What surprised me were the details. On a wall near his kitchen, there was a collection of framed charcoal sketches. They were incredibly detailed anatomical studies of hands, each one capturing a different gesture, clenched, open, holding a tool. They were beautiful and sensitive, and on a small table by his couch, there was a stack of books, not about woodworking, but about poetry. Mary Oliver and Walt Whitman were on top. This was not the man I had constructed from sounds and brief glances. The quiet, serious carpenter was also an artist, a reader. It was like discovering a hidden room in a house you thought you knew. He showed me to the guest room, a small, simple space with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the same quiet street as my own. "It's not much," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture I was quickly learning meant he was nervous or uncomfortable. "But the bed is comfortable. I made the frame myself. That first night was a study in awkward politeness. We ordered pizza because neither of us had the energy to think about cooking. We sat at that magnificent walnut table, the pizza box a sort of cardboard buffer between us. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the sound of chewing. I was hyper-aware of everything. The way he held his fork, the slight frown of concentration on his face as he ate, the low rumble of his voice when he asked if I wanted another slice. "I really am sorry about all this," he said, for what must have been the 10th time. "Mr. Henderson said my insurance will cover the repairs to your place, but still, your home, your work, it's a huge disruption." "It's not your fault," I said, and I meant it. Pipes burst. It's an old building. It could have happened to anyone. I was trying to put him at ease, but I was also trying to convince myself. This situation was an accident, a random act of plumbing chaos. It didn't mean anything. But as the days started to blur together, it began to feel like it meant something. We fell into a strange, domestic rhythm. I'd set up my drawing tablet at one end of his large dining table while he worked in his workshop, which was a sectioned-off portion of his main living space. The sounds I used to hear through the floor were now immediate and present, the whir of a saw, the tap of a chisel. But now they were accompanied by the sight of him, lost in his work, covered in a fine layer of sawdust that caught the light. He was surprisingly considerate as a roommate. He'd make a pot of coffee in the morning and silently leave a mug on the table for me before disappearing into his workshop. In the evenings, he would insist on cooking. And he was an incredible cook, making simple, hearty meals that filled the apartment with the smell of roasting garlic and herbs. We'd eat together, and slowly, the silences became less heavy and more comfortable. One evening, after dinner, he gestured towards my tablet. Can I see what you do?" he asked, his voice hesitant, as if he were afraid of intruding. I was taken aback. No one ever really asked to see my work in progress, only the finished product. I felt a flutter of anxiety, but I turned the tablet towards him and swiped through some of my recent illustrations. He leaned in, his focus absolute. He wasn't just glancing, he was studying them. He was quiet for a long time, his eyes tracing the lines and colors. "Wow," he finally said, his voice soft with what sounded like genuine awe. "You're really talented, Lucas. The way you use light, it's incredible. It feels so warm." His praise felt different from a client's approval. It was personal. It was a connection being forged over the things we created. "Those sketches," I said, nodding towards his wall. "They're amazing. You have a great eye for detail." A faint blush rose on his cheeks, and he looked away, suddenly shy. "They're just studies," he mumbled. "I get obsessed with how things are put together. Hands, joints in wood. It's all just structure, that was it." That was the moment I saw the vulnerability beneath the self-assured exterior. He was passionate and maybe even a little insecure about his art, just like me. He wasn't just the stoic carpenter from my daydreams. He was a person, complex and layered and far more interesting than I ever could have imagined. Later that week, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of him moving around in the main room. I got out of bed, my curiosity getting the better of me, and peeked out of my doorway. The lights were off, but the glow from the streetlights outside illuminated the space. Julian was sitting on the floor, his back against the couch, a large ledger book open on his lap and a calculator in his hand. He wasn't working on wood. He was staring at numbers, and his shoulders were slumped in a way I hadn't seen before. He looked defeated. I almost retreated back into my room, feeling like an intruder, but then he sighed, a heavy, tired sound that echoed in the quiet apartment. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. Without thinking, I walked into the room. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. He jumped, startled, his head snapping up. "Lucas, sorry, did I wake you?" "No, I was already awake," I lied. I gestured to the ledger. "Everything all right?" He hesitated, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "Just the joys of running a small business," he said, his voice tight. "A big commission fell through today. A restaurant that was ordering a whole set of tables and chairs. They went under." He looked down at the numbers, his jaw tight. "It's fine. I'll be fine. It's just a setback." But I could see it was more than that. I saw the worry etched around his eyes. This strong, capable man who built solid, enduring things was dealing with the same precariousness that I was, the same fear of a project falling through, of a client disappearing. In that moment, he wasn't the unattainable man from upstairs. He was just a guy, trying to make it work, scared of failing. I sat down on the floor a few feet away from him. I didn't say anything, didn't offer any empty platitudes. I just sat with him in the dark, in the shared silence of our anxieties. After a few minutes, he closed the ledger with a soft thud. "Thanks," he said, not looking at me. I knew he wasn't just thanking me for the company. He was thanking me for not prying, for not trying to fix it. He was thanking me for just being there. A small, shared moment of vulnerability in the middle of the night. It was more intimate than any conversation we'd had. And it was the moment I realized I was in serious trouble. My harmless crush was rapidly becoming anything but. The turning point came on a Friday night, the 5th day of my cohabitation with Julian. It was the day my carefully constructed emotional defenses began to crumble in earnest. I'd been working on a particularly difficult commission, a full-page spread for a fantasy novel that involved a complex, swirling vortex of magical energy. I'd been staring at the screen for hours, drawing and redrawing the same lines, and my brain felt like it was turning to static. A familiar, throbbing tension was building at the base of my skull, the kind of headache that signals the end of productivity. I must have groaned out loud in frustration because I heard the sound of tools being set down in the workshop area. A moment later, Julian appeared, wiping his hands on a rag. He had a fine layer of sawdust in his hair that looked like gold dust under the warm lights of the apartment. "You've been at that all day," he said, his voice gentle. "Maybe it's time for a break." "I can't," I said, rubbing my temples. "This is due Monday, and I can't get this one element right. It looks flat." I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes against the pounding in my head. He was quiet for a moment. When I opened my eyes, he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of concern and something else, something deeper. "You can't force it," he said softly. "You're tense. It's in your shoulders." He took a step closer. "Come on, stand up for a minute." His tone was so calm and assured that I obeyed without question. I pushed my chair back and stood up, rolling my shoulders, which were as tight as clenched fists. The headache was getting worse, a sharp, pulsing pain behind my eyes. "Okay, now what, coach?" I tried to joke, but my voice came out strained. He didn't smile. Instead, he reached out and dimmed the main overhead lights, leaving us in the softer glow of a single floor lamp. Then he walked over to a small speaker on his bookshelf, and, after a moment of scrolling on his phone, a stream of quiet, instrumental music filled the room. It was gentle, just a simple piano melody. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The world seemed to soften at the edges. "Just relax," he said, his voice a low murmur. He came to stand behind me. My heart started beating a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. What was happening? I used to get headaches like that when I spent too long hunched over a detailed piece. My dad taught me this. Before I could process his words, his hands settled on my shoulders. His touch was electric. It wasn't light or hesitant, it was firm and confident. His hands were large and warm, and I could feel the slight roughness of calluses on his palms through the fabric of my t-shirt. My entire body went rigid. I forgot how to breathe. "Easy," he whispered, his voice close to my ear. "Just breathe." He began to knead the tight muscles at the base of my neck and across my shoulders. It was a slow, deliberate pressure, an expert search for every knot of tension. He found them all. With each movement, I could feel the tightness beginning to melt away, the rigid shield of my anxiety starting to crack. The intimacy of the act was staggering. He was standing so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I could smell that scent of sawdust and clean soap that clung to him. My head was spinning, and it had nothing to do with the headache anymore. This was so far beyond the boundaries of a casual, temporary roommate arrangement. This was something else entirely. My mind was racing, trying to categorize what was happening. Was this just a kind gesture? A simple, platonic act of comfort from a considerate person? Or was it more? Was this a signal, a question being asked without words? I was terrified of misinterpreting it, of projecting my own burgeoning feelings onto an act of simple kindness. But the way he was touching me, it felt too knowing, too personal. His thumbs pressed into the tense spot just below my skull, and an involuntary sigh escaped my lips. The headache was receding, being replaced by a dizzying wave of something else, a deep, aching want. I let my head fall forward, surrendering to his touch. I was completely vulnerable, and in that moment, I trusted him implicitly. He worked in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds being the soft piano music and the whisper of our breathing. My thoughts, which had been racing a mile a minute, began to slow down. All I could focus on was the feeling of his hands on my skin, the strength and the gentleness in his touch. He wasn't just relieving the tension in my muscles. He was calming the frantic chaos in my soul. Finally, his hands stilled. He let them rest on my shoulders for a long moment, his thumbs stroking the sides of my neck just once. The gesture was so tender it made my throat ache. Then, slowly, he stepped back. The absence of his touch was like a sudden chill. I turned around to face him. The room felt charged, the air thick with everything that hadn't been said. He was looking at me, his dark eyes searching my face. His own expression was unguarded, open, and I saw the same question in his eyes that was screaming in my own mind. What was that? What is this? Better, he asked, his voice a little rough. I could only nod, my voice having abandoned me. Yeah, I finally managed to whisper. Thank you. Any time, he said, and the words hung in the air between us, heavy with potential meaning. He held my gaze for another beat, then cleared his throat and took a half step back, breaking the spell. I should clean up in the shop. And then he was gone, retreating to his side of the room, leaving me standing in the dim light with the ghost of his touch still burning on my skin. The headache was gone, but in its place was a profound and terrifying hope. The dynamic between us had been irrevocably altered. We were no longer just roommates, and I had no idea what we were supposed to be now. The next morning, the apartment was filled with a thick, unspoken tension. It was like the air pressure had dropped before a storm. I woke up early, my mind replaying every second of the shoulder rub on a continuous, torturous loop. The feeling of his hands, the warmth of his body, the look in his eyes afterward. I dissected every detail, searching for meaning, for confirmation. Was I crazy? Had I imagined the whole thing? When I emerged from the guest room, Julian was already in the kitchen, making coffee. He was usually so relaxed in the mornings, moving with an easy grace. But today, his movements were stiff, almost clumsy. He didn't seem to hear me approach until I was right there. Morning, I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He startled, sloshing a bit of coffee onto the counter. Oh, hey, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. He grabbed a cloth and wiped up the spill with far more focus than was necessary. Coffee's ready. Thanks. I poured myself a mug, my hand feeling unsteady. We stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island, a wide expanse of polished wood that felt like a canyon between us. The comfortable silence we had developed over the past week was gone, replaced by a brittle, awkward quiet. We were both acutely aware of what had happened, and we were both terrified to acknowledge it. I retreated to my end of the dining table, pretending to be absorbed in my emails. He disappeared into his workshop, but there were no sounds of saws or sanders, just silence. I risked a glance over and saw him just standing there, staring at a piece of wood as if he'd forgotten what it was for. He was as lost in his own head as I was in mine. My internal monologue was a raging debate. One side, the hopeful, romantic side, insisted that the intimacy we shared was undeniable. It wasn't just a friendly gesture. It was a question, an opening. He was waiting for me to respond, to give some kind of sign. The other side of my brain, the cautious, self-protective side that had been in charge for years, was screaming that I was a fool. He was just being nice. He was a kind, tactile person, and I was reading my own desperate desires into his actions. If I said something, if I tried to bridge that gap, I would not only face rejection but also make the last few days of our forced cohabitation unbearable. I would ruin the fragile friendship we had managed to build. The fear of that second possibility was paralyzing. Rejection I could handle, eventually. But the thought of sitting across the table from him, knowing I had made him uncomfortable, knowing I had misinterpreted everything so completely, that was a special kind of humiliation I wasn't sure I could endure. So I said nothing, and he said nothing, and the silence stretched and grew, filling every corner of the apartment. We spent the entire day avoiding each other. We ate lunch at different times. I kept my headphones on, even when I wasn't listening to music, as a clear do not disturb sign. He stayed in his workshop, and the sounds that eventually came from it were sporadic and uncertain. It felt like we were two ghosts haunting the same house, painfully aware of each other's presence, but unable to connect. The awkwardness was a physical thing. I could feel it in my chest, a heavy weight that made it hard to breathe. I kept replaying the scene. His hands, his voice. Had he felt it too? That spark, that sudden shift in the energy between us? He must have, right? Or was I so starved for connection that I was inventing chemistry where there was only kindness? Every time he walked through the main room, my senses went on high alert. I was aware of the sound of his footsteps, the way the light caught his hair, the scent of sawdust that followed him. It was exhausting. Hope and fear were at war inside me, and they were tearing me apart. Hope whispered that this was the start of something incredible. Fear countered that I was setting myself up for a devastating fall. That evening, Mr. Henderson called. "Good news, Lucas," he said, his voice tinny through the phone. "The dehumidifiers did their job faster than expected. We can get the plasterers in tomorrow, and you should be able to move back into your place by Monday evening. The floors will be the last thing, but you can live around that." The news should have been a relief. My ordeal was almost over. My life could go back to normal. But instead of relief, a cold dread washed over me. My time here, my time with Julian, was coming to an end. The bubble we had been living in was about to burst. If I didn't say something, this chance, this strange, unexpected opportunity, would be gone forever. He would go back to being the man upstairs, and I would go back to being the man downstairs, and the space between us would once again be just floorboards and plumbing. The thought was unbearable. The silence in the apartment suddenly felt less like a temporary awkwardness and more like a countdown clock. I had about 24 hours to either take the biggest emotional risk of my life or retreat back into the safety of my shell and wonder, what if, for the rest of my days? And honestly, I had no idea which one I was going to choose. The fear of rejection was immense, but the fear of regret was starting to feel even bigger. The final day arrived with a sense of quiet finality. The awkwardness from the day before had settled into a kind of melancholic resignation. We both knew my time here was ending. We exchanged polite morning greetings, the conversation stilted and focused on logistics. I started gathering my things, packing the few clothes I'd brought into my duffel bag, the movements feeling slow and heavy, as if I were moving through water. I was in the guest room, folding a shirt, when Julian appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked tired, and there was a tension in his jaw that I recognized from the night I'd found him stressing over his business ledgers. He watched me for a moment, the silence stretching out between us. "So," he said, his voice low, "you'll be glad to get back to your own space." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, flat and devoid of emotion. "Yeah," I replied, my voice equally flat, betraying none of the turmoil I was feeling. "It'll be good to get back to normal." I folded another shirt with meticulous, unnecessary precision. This was it. The polite goodbye. The end of the strangest week of my life. My heart ached with the missed opportunity. He didn't leave. He just stayed there, watching me. I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my hands tremble slightly. Finally, he pushed himself off the doorframe and took a step into the room. "Lucas," he said, and my name sounded different, freighted with a weight it didn't normally carry. I stopped what I was doing and looked up at him. "Here's the thing," he began, and he was staring at a spot on the floor, unable to meet my eyes. "The repairs, they could have been done yesterday." I blinked, confused. "What?" Mr. Henderson said. "I know what he said," Julian interrupted, finally looking up at me. His eyes were filled with a raw, desperate vulnerability that stole the air from my lungs. "I asked him to tell you they needed one more day. I told him I'd cover the cost of the plasterer's delay. I needed one more day." My brain struggled to process his words. He had stalled the repairs? Why? The hope I had been trying so desperately to suppress surged through me, fierce and overwhelming. "Why?" I whispered, the question hanging in the air. He took another step closer. We were only a few feet apart now. "Because I'm an idiot," he said, with a short, self-deprecating laugh. "Because I've been trying to figure out how to talk to you for 6 months. I'd see you in the hall, and my brain would just completely short-circuit. All I could ever manage was, hey." He shook his head, looking frustrated with himself. Then the pipe burst, and it was this horrible, awful thing, but it was also this chance. This insane, undeserved chance to actually get to know you. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture agitated and nervous. And this has been the best week. Getting to see your art, hearing you laugh. And then Friday night happened. He finally looked me straight in the eye. The shoulder rub. He stumbled over the words. That wasn't just me being nice, Lucas. I wanted to touch you. And when you turned around and looked at me, I just panicked. I thought maybe I had crossed a line, that I'd misread everything and made you uncomfortable. Every word he spoke was a balm on my anxious soul, unwinding the knots of doubt and fear that had been tightening in my chest for the past 24 hours. He had felt it too. He had been just as scared, just as uncertain. I haven't been able to think straight since, he continued, his voice growing stronger, more confident. And when I heard you'd be leaving today, I realized I couldn't let you go back downstairs without telling you. I couldn't go back to just saying hey in the hallway. I can't. I was speechless. All my internal agonizing, all my fear, and he had been feeling the same things. I took a step toward him, closing the remaining distance between us. Julian, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I thought I was the only one. I thought I was completely imagining it. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was like watching the sun break through the clouds. You felt it too? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Instead of answering with words, I reached out and gently touched his arm. The contact was explosive, a confirmation of everything that had been simmering beneath the surface. He looked down at my hand on his arm and then back up at my face. And then, he did what I had been dreaming about all week. He leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't tentative or questioning like I might have expected. It was a kiss full of pent-up longing and relief, of weeks of unspoken attraction and days of unbearable tension finally being released. His mouth was soft and warm, and he tasted faintly of coffee. He brought his hands up to cup my face, his calloused thumbs stroking my cheeks. I wrapped my arms around his waist, pulling him closer, wanting to erase any space that had ever existed between us. We were done just talking. We were done with awkward silences and missed signals. In that kiss, we said everything we had been too afraid to say out loud. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, and we just stood there, breathing each other in. So, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, a real, genuine smile that lit up his eyes. Does this mean you'll stay for dinner? I laughed, a real, joyful sound of pure relief. I think I can manage that, I said. But just so we're clear, my apartment is still getting fixed. I might need a place to stay for another night or two. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his expression full of a hope that mirrored my own. Take all the time you need, he said softly. Take forever. A few months later, I was standing in our kitchen, watching him carefully slice vegetables for dinner. The evening light streamed through the large window, catching the stray bits of sawdust that still seemed to cling to him no matter how often he showered, making them glitter like gold. He had a look of intense concentration on his face, the same look he got when he was working on a tricky piece of dovetail joinery. It was a look I had come to love. I no longer lived downstairs. After my apartment was repaired, we spent a week pretending, me going back to my place at night, before we both admitted it was ridiculous. My apartment became my dedicated studio, and I moved my life into his. Our lives. We filled the space with a comfortable blend of both of us, his solid, beautiful furniture and my colorful artwork, his classic rock and my quiet indie playlists, the scent of his woodshop mingling with the smell of my paints. The wall that had once held only his charcoal sketches of hands now had my illustrations hanging alongside them. Our art, our lives intertwined. It felt right. It felt like coming home to a place I hadn't known I was searching for. Our days found a new rhythm, one that was infinitely better than the solitary one I had known before. It was a rhythm of shared morning coffees, of quiet, companionable work, and of evenings spent cooking together or just talking on the couch. The gaping, ugly hole in the ceiling of my old apartment was long gone. In its place was a beautiful, custom-built set of floating shelves, made from a rich, dark cherry wood. Julian had designed and built them for me as a housewarming gift when I'd officially moved in. He'd said he wanted to turn the spot where everything went wrong into something beautiful, a reminder that sometimes the best things can come from a complete disaster. He finished chopping the carrots and scraped them into the sizzling pan on the stove, the sound filling our comfortable silence. He glanced over at me and smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made my stomach do a little flip. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Just about burst pipes," I said, walking over to wrap my arms around him from behind, resting my chin on his broad shoulder. I felt him lean back into my embrace. "Still holding a grudge against my plumbing?" he teased, his voice a low rumble I could feel through his chest. "Nope," I said, pressing a kiss to the side of his neck. "I'm thinking I should send it a thank you card," he laughed, a deep, happy sound that felt like the anchor of my world now. It's funny, isn't it? How we build these walls around ourselves, these routines and assumptions, thinking they'll keep us safe. We create entire narratives for the people we pass in the hallway, placing them in neat little boxes to keep our own worlds from getting too complicated. But life has a way of springing leaks. Sometimes it takes a little chaos, a flood, to break down those walls and wash away the illusions, leaving you standing in the wreckage with the one person you were always meant to find. And you realize that the mess, the disruption, the terrifying vulnerability, it was all worth it. It's what makes the foundation strong enough to build a life on.